Hello, and welcome to Mind Sherlock, where every story feels like a conversation over a warm cup of coffee. Today, I bring you a brand new Sherlock Holmes mystery, filled with twists, clues, and clever deductions. Make yourself comfortable, and let's unravel the case together. And if you'd like, leave a quick comment and tell me where you're joining from. It's always a pleasure to know where our little detective community is tuning in from. Now, let's get started. It was on a particularly cold evening in the autumn of 1896 that I found myself once again in the familiar cluttered confines of 221B Baker Street. Outside, the gas lamps flickered against the thick London fog, their glow barely penetrating the dreary night. Within, a fire crackled in the grate, though it did little to dispel the deep shadows that stretched across the room. Sherlock Holmes sat in his usual chair, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin, his sharp eyes fixed upon the ceiling. The only movement was the occasional curl of blue smoke rising from his pipe, dissipating into the dimly lit air. I had seen him in this state before, a mind too sharp to tolerate stagnation, a predator starved of the thrill of the chase. I knew better than to disturb him. Holmes in deep contemplation was as unapproachable as a statue carved from marble. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. I occupied myself with the evening paper, though the words swam before my eyes, my attention drawn instead to my companion's peculiar stillness. Then, without warning, Holmes stirred. "Watson," he said, his voice laced with the sharp impatience of a man long denied amusement. "I fear London has conspired against me. Not a single case of true merit has presented itself in the past week. It is positively insufferable." I set down my paper with a small smile. Surely not all cases require murder to be of interest. Holmes sighed, tapping his fingers against the arm of his chair. A missing cat, a lost brooch, and a dispute over a baker's secret recipe. These are the trifles that have been paraded before me. He exhaled slowly, his gaze flickering towards the door. "I am beginning to think that criminal enterprise itself has grown dull." As if in response to his lament, there came a sudden, urgent knock at the door. Mrs. Hudson's footsteps echoed in the hallway, and a moment later, she opened the door to announce the arrival of a visitor. He stepped forward, and at once I took in his unusual appearance. His finely tailored coat bore the unmistakable cut of Parisian fashion. His gloves were of the softest silk, yet his boots carried the scuff marks of a man who had travelled in great haste. The man hesitated in the doorway, casting a quick, wary glance about the room before stepping forward. His face, though composed, bore the pallor of one who had not slept, and his eyes held a nervous flicker that betrayed the turmoil within. "Messieurs," he said, his voice carrying the faintest trace of a French accent, "I must apologize for this intrusion. I come on a matter of the utmost urgency." Holmes leaned forward, his eyes bright with curiosity. "Then you have come to precisely the right place." The gentleman removed his gloves with deliberate care, though his fingers trembled slightly. He hesitated, as if weighing his words before speaking. And in that pause, I saw Holmes's eyes dart over him, taking in every minute detail. "Your name, sir?" I prompted gently. The man swallowed before answering. "I am Count Henri Devereux." A glance at Holmes, and his voice dropped lower. "And I have reason to believe that my very life may be at stake." Holmes said nothing at first, his gaze shifting momentarily to the dark smudge of ink on the man's cuff, the fine dust on his sleeve, the tension in his jaw. Then, with a faint, knowing smile, He leaned back in his chair. "You arrived in London this morning, travelling under a false name," he remarked. "You have not slept in over 24 hours, and if I am not mistaken, your predicament involves the French monarchy." The Count stiffened. His lips parted in shock. "But how could you possibly—" Holmes waved a hand dismissively. "The ink on your fingers suggests recent correspondence, yet the smudge on your sleeve tells me it was done in haste. You arrived in London this morning, given the distinct moisture marks on your boots, indicating the crossing of the Channel in the early hours. You travelled under a false name, evidenced by the faint indentation on the inside of your glove, where a signet ring would usually rest. No man of your status removes such an item unless secrecy demands it." He allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. "And as for the monarchy?" "A stolen crown is hardly a mystery, my dear Watson. The mystery is why it was stolen." Count Devereux exhaled sharply, the weight of the moment pressing upon him. "Monsieur Holmes, you are exactly the man I need." Count Henri Devereux leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly together, as though the mere act of speaking his next words required an effort of great will. "The crown is gone," he said at last. "Stolen 2 nights ago from a private exhibition in Paris." Holmes arched an eyebrow. "A crown? Not just any bauble, I presume?" "The crown of St. Louis," Devereux confirmed. "A relic of the French monarchy, kept in the private possession of my family since the fall of the Bourbons. It was displayed only briefly, in secret, for certain influential parties." "Influential indeed," Holmes murmured. "And what of security? 12 armed men, an impenetrable vault, and a system of alarms so sensitive it would detect the brush of a feather. Yet in the morning, the vault was empty, the alarms silent, and the guards found unconscious." Holmes steepled his fingers. "A crime of considerable artistry." Devereux's mouth tightened. "A crime of treason, Monsieur Holmes. This is no ordinary theft. It is an attack on France itself." Holmes leaned forward, eyes bright with interest. "Now, Count, you have my full attention." I frowned. "Surely a lost crown is merely a historical inconvenience." Devereux gave me a sharp look. "Dr. Watson, the monarchy still breathes in the shadows of France. There are those who wish to see it restored. The crown was to be a symbol, proof that the royalists were ready." Holmes tapped his fingers against the arm of his chair. "And now it is in unknown hands. A dangerous development." "More than you know," Devereux said. "If the crown were to be paraded in public, it would be seen as a declaration, one that could send France into chaos." "A revolution over a piece of gold and gemstones?" I asked. Holmes shook his head. "A revolution over what it represents. A single artifact can alter the course of history." Devereux nodded. "I was its guardian. I shall be its scapegoat if it is not recovered. That is why I have come to you, Monsieur Holmes." Holmes leaned back, fingers tapping against his lips. The game grows more interesting by the moment. Holmes' eyes flickered over the Count's hands. "You have been writing extensively in the last day," he remarked. Devereux started. "How could you possibly—" "The ink stains upon your fingers, Count, yet the smudges are uneven, some fresh, some older. You have been in contact with a correspondent over several days." The Count hesitated. "I reached out to certain individuals, men who might have information." "Men," Holmes said lightly, "who deal in secrets." The Count stiffened. "I do not deal with criminals, Monsieur Holmes." "On the contrary," Holmes replied, "you have already done so, unwittingly or not, and one of them has lied to you." Devereux exhaled sharply. What do you mean? Holmes pointed to a faint smudge of red wax on the Count's cuff. A letter sealed in haste. You received information, but I suspect it was designed to mislead you. The Count's expression darkened. Then I have been deceived. Not for long, Holmes said. Now tell me of this supposed thief. Devereux exhaled sharply. His name is Alistair Craythorne, an Englishman, a master of deception. Holmes's expression did not change. A name I know well, I started. You do? Indeed, Holmes said, tapping his fingers together. Craythorne is an artist among thieves. His talent is not in brute force, but in the illusion of impossibility. He specializes in vanishing acts. Devereux nodded grimly. Then he has outdone himself. He was seen in Paris on the night of the theft. By morning, he was gone. A conjurer's trick, Holmes mused. One moment he is there, the next. Nothing remains but his shadow. I furrowed my brow. But if he is as good as you claim, how do we find him? Holmes smiled faintly. We do not find Craythorne, Watson. We invite him into the light. The question is not where he is, but what he wants. Devereux tensed. And what does he want? Holmes's smile grew. That, Count, is what we shall soon uncover. Holmes stood, pacing the room. Craythorne does not steal for profit, nor for mere sport. He steals for power. I frowned. You mean political power? Holmes shook his head. No, Watson, the power of knowledge. He is a man who thrives on secrets. To him, the crown is not gold. It is a bargaining tool. Devereux's brow furrowed. Then he means to sell it? Perhaps, Holmes mused. But to whom? That is what interests me. He turned suddenly to the Count. You must tell me everything, Count Devereux. No detail is too small. Devereux hesitated. There was one thing. Holmes's eyes gleamed. Ah, there always is. A playing card left behind in the vault, Devereux said. The King of Diamonds. Holmes stopped pacing. His fingers drummed once against his chin. Now that, he murmured, is very interesting. Holmes turned to me. Watson, pack your bags. I blinked. What? We leave for Paris on the next train. Devereux looked relieved. You will take the case then? Holmes gave him a look of mild amusement. Take it. My dear Count, I must take it. A vanishing thief, a misplaced relic, and a kingdom on the brink of chaos. His eyes gleamed with the sharp excitement of a man who had just been presented with a riddle worth solving. This is a puzzle woven with layers of deception, he continued. Craythorne is playing a game, but he does not yet know that he is not the only player. Devereux exhaled in relief. Then you believe you can find him? Holmes smiled. Count, it is not a matter of if, it is only a matter of when. We departed London at dawn, Holmes in uncharacteristically high spirits, which I attributed less to the charm of Paris and more to the tantalizing intricacies of the case before him. He had hardly spoken a word on the journey, save for the occasional remark on the habits of our fellow passengers, deductions made in such offhand precision that I could scarcely determine whether he meant to impress me or was simply incapable of turning his mind away from the endless puzzle of human nature. Upon our arrival, we secured rooms at a small hotel in the Rue de Rivoli, where Holmes wasted no time in arranging a private visit to the estate from which the crown had vanished. A palace of secrets, no doubt, he mused, and if a thief of Craythorne's caliber chose it for his stage, then it is worth examining the theatre itself. As we rode through the streets, Holmes remained uncharacteristically silent, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. You are deep in thought, I remarked. Holmes turned to me, his eyes gleaming. Watson, tell me, what is the rarest quality in a successful thief? I frowned. Skill, planning, Holmes smiled. Patience, and I have a distinct suspicion that our thief is waiting for something. The estate stood on the outskirts of Montmartre, an opulent mansion that bore the unmistakable marks of old nobility. As we approached, I noted the high iron gates, the grand facade, and the unmistakable air of wealth that clung to the place like perfume. Holmes, however, seemed indifferent to its grandeur. His gaze swept the surroundings with the keen interest of a man searching for something invisible to the untrained eye. "We shall begin," he said, "not with the vault, nor the guards, nor even the supposed crime scene, but with what the thief did not take." The footman led us through the long corridors, their marble floors echoing our steps, until we reached the inner sanctum, where the crown had once been displayed. The vault door was open, its locks broken with surgical precision. Holmes studied it with an expression of mild amusement. "Ah, but this was not brute force, Watson. This was done with a confidence that suggests inside knowledge." "You suspect an accomplice?" I asked. Holmes smiled faintly. "My dear Watson, I suspect many things, but for now, let us hear what Madame Rochelle has to say." Madame Rochelle was a woman of indeterminate age, her stern features suggesting she had long since ceased being impressed by the affairs of men. She regarded us warily before turning her attention to Holmes, whom she seemed to appraise as one might a particularly untrustworthy guest. "You wish to know of the night in question?" she asked, folding her arms. "Then I shall tell you. The guards were drugged, every last one of them. They woke with no memory of what happened." Holmes nodded. "And how was the drug administered?" "A bottle of wine, sent as a gift the evening before." She scoffed. "Fools drinking wine from an unknown sender." Holmes's expression did not change. "Tell me, madame, when you discovered the theft, was anything left behind?" Her eyes darkened. "Only a single playing card, the King of Diamonds." I started. "A signature?" Holmes merely smiled. "A challenge." He turned to Madame Rochelle. "And tell me, madame, did any guest that evening wear a red cloak?" She hesitated. "Yes," she said at last, "but I do not remember their face." Holmes turned to me, his eyes bright. "Then we are precisely where we need to be." Holmes held the playing card between his fingers, turning it this way and that in the dim light of the study. The King of Diamonds stared back at us, his painted expression unmoving, yet strangely mocking. "A peculiar calling card," I remarked. Holmes smiled faintly. "Peculiar indeed, and entirely intentional." Devereux shifted uneasily. "You believe it to be a message?" Holmes tapped the card against his palm. "Craythorne is no common thief, Count. He does not leave clues by accident. This is not evidence. It is an invitation." "To what?" I asked. Holmes's eyes gleamed. "To a game, Watson. A game in which he believes himself the superior player." Devereux frowned. "Then you believe he stole the crown?" Holmes exhaled slowly. "Ah, but that is the question, is it not? This card tells me only one thing with certainty." "And what is that?" I asked. "That Craythorne wants us to think he stole the crown." There was a pause before Holmes continued, his voice thoughtful. "But a true magician never reveals his hand so easily." He turned the card over, studying the surface carefully. "And this," he murmured, "is where we begin." Holmes brought the card to the light, tilting it at an angle. His sharp eyes narrowed. "Ah," he murmured, "I thought as much." "What is it?" I asked, stepping forward. He handed me the card. At first glance there was nothing unusual about it, but then, as I turned it under the light, I saw it. A faint impression, nearly invisible, as though something had been pressed against the surface and removed. "A wax seal," Holmes confirmed. "A careless oversight on Craythorne's part." Devereux's face darkened. A wax seal? From whom? That, Holmes said, is the more interesting question. He reached for a small vial of fine chalk powder from his pocket and dusted it lightly over the card. The impression became clearer, an ornate crest, its details partially obscured. Holmes studied it for a moment before nodding. As I suspected, he said, the mark of the Order of Saint-Amand. Devereux inhaled sharply. Impossible. Holmes merely smiled. Not at all, Count. It appears that your stolen crown has drawn the attention of a secret society. He tapped the card once against his fingertips. And that changes everything. We had scarcely left the estate before Holmes declared his need for a moment's contemplation, which, in practice, meant finding a quiet café where he could analyse the situation over a strong cup of coffee. We settled into a small establishment on the Boulevard des Capucines, where Holmes sat with his arms folded, eyes half closed, deep in thought. I failed to see how this changes everything, I admitted. The crown is still missing, and Craythorne is still our thief. Holmes opened his eyes. My dear Watson, do observe more carefully. Craythorne may be a master of deception, but he does not work alone. The presence of this wax seal suggests another hand in the game. At that moment, a man brushed past our table, a folded newspaper under his arm. Holmes's gaze flickered to him briefly. Then he turned to me with a smile. The gentleman in the brown coat, Watson. Tell me, what do you deduce about him? I frowned. He's, well, middle-aged, likely a businessman. Holmes sighed. Observe his cufflinks, the emblem of the London Stock Exchange, yet his shoes are scuffed and his fingers are ink-stained. Conclusion? I hesitated. Holmes leaned forward, his smile widening. A stockbroker, down on his luck, with recent losses significant enough to require him to pawn his finer boots. I shook my head. You astound me, Holmes. He sipped his coffee. Then imagine what Craythorne must feel. Holmes led me through the winding alleys of Le Marais, his pace brisk, his expression unreadable. He had said little since leaving the cafe, save for the brief instruction that we were to meet an old acquaintance of his. I had learned long ago that pressing Holmes for details before he was ready to give them was an exercise in futility, so I followed in silence. At last, we arrived at a small wine shop tucked between two taller buildings. Holmes entered without hesitation, nodding to the proprietor, who led us through a curtain to a dimly lit back room. A woman sat at the table, her posture one of studied indifference. She was middle-aged, with sharp eyes that missed nothing. A cigarette rested between her fingers, curling smoke into the air. Camille, Holmes greeted her, taking the seat opposite. She exhaled a stream of smoke. Monsieur Holmes, I was beginning to wonder if you had lost your touch. Holmes gave a slight smile. A man of my talents is rarely lost, only waiting. Camille flicked her cigarette into an ashtray. And now you are searching for something. Holmes leaned forward. I seek Alistair Craythorne. Camille raised an eyebrow. Then you are looking in the wrong direction, mon cher. He is no longer in Paris, but... She tapped her fingers against the table. Before he disappeared, he was seen with a woman. Holmes's eyes gleamed. Now that is interesting. A woman? I repeated. Camille nodded. Tall, elegant, dressed in red. Holmes's fingers tapped lightly against the table. And yet you do not know her name. Camille smirked. Names are irrelevant in my business. What matters is what she wanted, and she wanted Craythorne's attention. Holmes exhaled softly. So she approached him? Camille nodded. In the Salle Garnier 2 nights ago. I frowned. The opera house? A fitting place for deception, Holmes murmured. And what transpired? She whispered something to him, something that made him leave immediately. Holmes's smile was almost imperceptible. Intriguing. Camille studied him. You have an idea who she is. Holmes gave a slow nod. I have an idea of what she represents. Camille exhaled through her nose. Then you are already ahead of me, mon cher. She reached into her coat and withdrew a folded piece of paper, sliding it across the table. Holmes unfolded it, his expression unreadable. What is it? I asked. His lips curled slightly. A message, and a rather cryptic one at that. Holmes read the note aloud. The thief is not who you think. Watch the stage tonight. A flicker of amusement crossed his face. Ah, now that is very theatrical. I frowned. What stage? The opera house? Camille shrugged. I do not know. The note was delivered to one of my men. No sender. Just that message. Holmes turned the paper over, studying it under the dim light. Then, with the faintest smile, he tapped the edge against the table. The ink, he murmured. A rare blend, used exclusively by the costumers of the Théâtre du Soleil. Camille chuckled. Of course you would know that. I leaned forward. Then we are going to the theatre. Holmes stood, tucking the note into his pocket. Naturally, Watson. If one wishes to unravel a performance, one must first observe the stage. Camille smirked. Bonne chance, Monsieur Holmes. Holmes buttoned his coat. Chance, Camille, is merely a matter of preparation. As we stepped out into the Parisian night, I could not shake the feeling that we had just been dealt our next move in a game where the opponent remained unseen. Holmes, however, walked with purpose. We are precisely where we need to be, he murmured. Holmes led me through the winding streets of Montmartre, his pace brisk, his mind seemingly far ahead of our steps. The note had given us our next destination, and though I did not yet see its full significance, Holmes, as ever, seemed to have unravelled more than he chose to reveal. The Cabaret Theatre, I said, glancing at the dimly lit entrance of a building tucked between two taller ones. Hardly the setting for a man like Craythorne. Holmes smiled. On the contrary, Watson, illusion, deception, vanishing acts, these are his natural elements. A doorman, dressed in dark velvet, gave us a knowing nod as Holmes slipped a few francs into his palm. Without a word, he gestured us through a concealed passage, leading into the underground theatre. The air inside was thick with perfume and smoke, the murmur of low voices blending with the distant sound of violin strings. Holmes did not pause to admire the decadence. Instead, he scanned the room with a critical eye, his gaze settling on a small, private balcony above the stage. Reserved seating, he murmured, for a most discerning guest. Before I could ask what he meant, the lights dimmed, and the murmurs ceased. A hush fell upon the room. Holmes leaned forward, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. The performance begins, he said. A hush settled over the audience as the curtains parted. She emerged from the shadows, dressed in scarlet silk, her presence commanding even before she spoke. There was a precision to her movements, a poise that suggested she was as much in control of the audience as she was of the performance itself. Holmes exhaled softly. Isabella Lenoir, he murmured. I turned to him. You know her? In a way, he said, though I suspect she knows us better. The performance was an illusionist's act, each segment growing in grandeur. She produced objects seemingly from thin air, each feat met with thunderous applause. Then, as the finale approached, her assistants wheeled forward a glass case draped in velvet. Holmes tensed beside me. Watch closely, Watson. With a flourish, Isabella removed the cloth, revealing a golden crown, its jewels glinting under the stage lights. I inhaled sharply. "Is that—" Holmes nodded. "The crown of St. Louis." A wave of murmurs swept through the crowd. Isabella raised a single gloved finger to her lips, commanding silence. Then, before our eyes, the crown vanished. The crowd erupted in applause, but Holmes remained unmoving. His gaze, sharp as ever, followed the performer's every move. "Not a thief, Watson," he murmured. "Something far more dangerous." Holmes sat in silence for several moments, watching as Isabella bowed to the roaring applause. He was perfectly still, his fingers resting lightly against his chin, his mind working at a speed I could only guess at. I leaned closer. "Holmes," he exhaled softly. "Watson, tell me, what is the purpose of an illusion?" "To deceive," I said. "Precisely. But deception requires intent." His eyes did not leave the stage. "That was not an act of theft, Watson." "That was a declaration." I frowned. "You mean she wishes to be caught?" Holmes smiled faintly. "No, my friend. She wishes to be seen." I shook my head. "Then what are we dealing with?" Holmes rose from his seat, adjusting his cuffs. "A woman who does not steal for greed, nor even for power." He turned to me, his expression unreadable. "This is no ordinary thief, Watson. This is a queen in exile." He stepped toward the exit, pausing only to cast a glance over his shoulder at the stage. "The game," he murmured, "is no longer one of mere crime." His eyes gleamed. "We are chasing a legend." Holmes wasted no time in setting his plan into motion. That very night, he dispatched a letter under an assumed name, Antoine Villard, a wealthy collector with a particular fondness for royal artifacts. The message was simple, yet direct. A private bid for the crown of St. Louis, far above its market value, to be exchanged in utmost secrecy. "We must make it irresistible," Holmes remarked as he dictated the final details to me. "Not only in price, but in discretion. Our dear Isabella will not wish to sell to the highest bidder, but to the safest." Devereux, who had been pacing in restless agitation, finally turned to him. "You believe she will accept?" Holmes gave a faint smile. "My dear Count, she has already accepted." "How can you be so sure?" I asked. Holmes gestured to the note Isabella had left at the theatre. "She performed a trick, Watson, and every performance demands an audience. She wants to be sought out, and she will see in this offer the opportunity to control the narrative." The response came swifter than I had expected. A small envelope, delivered by a street boy, containing a single word, "Minuit, midnight," along with an address in the Rue de Saint-Père. Holmes folded the note carefully. "And so, gentlemen, we have our meeting." I could not shake a growing unease. "And if she suspects a trap?" Holmes adjusted his cuffs, his eyes gleaming. "Then, Watson, we shall see who plays the better hand." The appointed meeting place was a small salon, tucked within an establishment of uncertain reputation. The dim lighting and heavy drapery suggested a place where discretion was both expected and enforced. A single table, set with crystal glasses and a decanter of wine, awaited us. Holmes, seated with the ease of a man perfectly at home in the midst of intrigue, watched the door in patient expectation. Devereux, however, was less composed. "What if she does not come?" he whispered. Holmes poured himself a glass of wine. "She will." "How do you know?" "Because she has more at stake than we do." Barely had the words left his lips when the door glided open. She entered without hesitation, her scarlet gown traded for something more understated, yet no less commanding. Her eyes, sharp as ever, flickered over us before settling on Holmes. Monsieur Villard, she greeted, her tone laced with amusement. Or shall I call you by your true name? Holmes did not so much as blink. That depends, Mademoiselle Lenoir. Are you a merchant or a monarch? A small smile played at her lips. That, she said, lowering herself gracefully into the chair opposite him, is the question, is it not? For a long moment there was silence between them. Then Holmes, without preamble, said, You never intended to sell the crown. I saw a flicker of something cross her face. Not surprise, but acknowledgement. Devereux's expression hardened. Then why steal it? Why make a spectacle of it? She turned to him with quiet dignity. Because, Count, there are men who would weaponize the past for their own ambitions. I did what was necessary. Holmes steepled his fingers. You mean to say, mademoiselle, that the true danger is not the theft of the crown, but its return? She inclined her head. If it were placed in the wrong hands, it would become more than a relic. It would become a banner. Devereux inhaled sharply. You wish to keep it hidden? To protect France from those who would see it burn. I turned to Holmes, expecting him to argue, to refute her claim, but instead he simply studied her, his sharp mind already leagues ahead of us all. You are not a thief, he murmured. You are a guardian. A ghost of a smile crossed her lips. You understand. Holmes leaned back, his fingers tapping softly against the armrest. Oh, I understand, mademoiselle, but tell me, who else does? For the first time, she hesitated, and in that hesitation, I saw what Holmes had seen all along. The game was far from over. The tension in the room was palpable, the silence stretched thin between us. Isabella Lenoir met Holmes's gaze with unwavering calm, her fingers poised near the stem of a crystal glass, as if the weight of our presence did not concern her in the slightest. Then, without warning, the door burst open. A figure strode inside, the gleam of steel in his hand catching the dim light. His face was sharp, angular, and unmistakably English. His grey eyes scanned the room, settling not on Isabella, but on the crown resting on the table. Holmes exhaled softly. Ah, Monsieur Craythorne, I presume. Alistair Craythorne, the most elusive jewel thief in Europe, gave a tight-lipped smile. A pleasure, Holmes. I regret that our introduction must be so uncivilized. He tilted his pistol slightly. Now, if you would be so kind as to step away from the crown. I tensed, but Holmes remained perfectly at ease. A rather dramatic entrance, he observed. Might I assume that you have not come alone? Craythorne's smirk faltered. I wouldn't count on reinforcements if I were you, Holmes. This job requires a delicate touch. Holmes nodded thoughtfully. Indeed. And yet, I suspect your presence here is not merely professional, but personal. Craythorne's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Holmes leaned forward. You are not here to steal the crown, are you? Craythorne's grip on the pistol did not waver, but there was something in his posture, something that told me Holmes had struck upon the truth. Isabella, too, was watching him now, her expression unreadable. Holmes steepled his fingers. The real question, Craythorne, is who sent you? For the first time, I saw uncertainty flicker in Craythorne's eyes. I work alone, he said. Holmes gave a small, knowing smile. Ah, but we both know that is not true. He gestured to the crown. You were sent to retrieve this, but not because you stole it. Craythorne's jaw clenched. Holmes continued smoothly. You were hired, not to steal, but to return it. You were hunting Isabella just as I was, because someone believes she is not a thief, but a threat. A shadow crossed Isabella's face. Who sent you, Craythorne? Craythorne said nothing. Holmes's voice was almost amused. A rather compromising situation for a professional such as yourself, betrayed by your own employer. Craythorne's eyes darkened. I was told to recover the crown. Holmes leaned back. And yet, they never intended for you to leave with it, did they? Silence. Craythorne exhaled sharply, lowering his pistol a fraction. It was a set-up. The moment I returned the crown, I was to be eliminated. Isabella's voice was quiet but firm. And you think that gives you the right to take it from me? Craythorne looked at her then, and for the first time his expression was not that of a thief, but of a man caught between two impossible choices. Holmes stood. Craythorne, you are a capable man, but you are not the only one who sees beyond the illusion. The real players in this game are those who remain unseen. Craythorne hesitated. Then, without warning, he raised his pistol once more. Then I suppose I must take my chances. And in that moment, I knew he was about to fire. Time seemed to slow. I reached for my revolver, but before I could act, I heard the unmistakable sound of an empty chamber clicking. Craythorne frowned. He pulled the trigger again. Nothing. Holmes smiled. Ah. You seem to have encountered a most unfortunate malfunction. Craythorne's eyes widened. He inspected the weapon, his fingers running along the barrel. You... Holmes nodded. Yes. I removed the bullets earlier this evening. Devereux let out a stunned breath. But how? Holmes adjusted his cuffs. A simple precaution. I suspected Craythorne would join us before the night was through. The question was never if, but when. Craythorne exhaled, his grip on the pistol loosening. Then, with a quiet curse, he tossed the weapon aside. I should have known. Holmes inclined his head. Yes, you should have. Isabella, who had remained silent throughout, now stood. And now, what do you intend to do, Monsieur Holmes? Holmes regarded her carefully. That, mademoiselle, depends entirely on you. A tense silence settled over the room. Then at last she reached for the crown, not in surrender, but in defiance. Holmes watched her with quiet amusement. I do not believe you will hand it over. She smiled faintly. Number I will not. Holmes nodded. Then I suggest we find another way. I turned to him in disbelief. Holmes, you cannot mean... But Holmes had already made his decision. This crown will never see the wrong hands, he said simply, but it will not be mine to decide where it belongs. He met Isabella's gaze. It is yours, mademoiselle, to protect or to destroy. Isabella studied him for a long moment. Then, slowly, she nodded. And just like that, the game had changed. The room was silent, not a breath, not a whisper. Even the ever-composed Isabella Lenoir sat frozen, her fingers lightly resting upon the crown, as if uncertain whether to hold or relinquish it. Holmes, ever unhurried, poured himself a glass of wine from the untouched decanter on the table. He swirled it absently, his gaze drifting over us before settling upon Isabella. There are few things in this world more revealing than what is left unsaid, he remarked. And yet, mademoiselle, you have been rather eloquent in your silences. She arched a brow. Have I? Holmes inclined his head. Indeed. From the moment you took the stage, you have not once denied that you stole the crown. And yet, you have made no attempt to flee. No desperate bargain, no plea for mercy. He took a sip of his wine. That is not the behaviour of a common criminal. That is the bearing of one who believes herself entitled. Devereux, who had remained rigid with barely contained frustration, scoffed. Entitled? To what? Theft? Holmes set his glass down. To history, my dear Count. Isabella's gaze did not waver. If anything, there was something almost amused in her expression. Holmes continued. There were signs, of course, small at first. Your posture, for one. You do not stand like a performer used to bowing before applause. Number, you hold yourself as one who expects deference, as though it were your birthright. He turned to me then, his eyes gleaming with quiet triumph. And then, Watson, there was the card. I blinked. The playing card? The King of Diamonds? Precisely. Holmes leaned forward. But not merely the King of Diamonds. The wax seal upon it. His fingers tapped against the table. A mark, however faint, that told me everything. At last, Isabella exhaled softly. And what, Monsieur Holmes? Do you believe it told you? Holmes allowed himself a small smile. That you, Mademoiselle Lenoir, are no mere actress. He lifted his glass once more. You are a descendant of the Bourbons. Devereux shot to his feet, his face pale with disbelief. Impossible! Holmes did not so much as flinch. On the contrary, Count, it is the only possibility. I glanced at Isabella, expecting her to refute him, to scoff or deny. Instead, she simply regarded Holmes with a quiet, almost knowing expression. Holmes steepled his fingers. The wax seal impression left upon the playing card. It was faint, but distinct enough to identify. His voice was calm, assured. The sigil of the House of Bourbon, a crest that has not been used openly in decades. He gestured toward Isabella. And yet, here we are, sitting across from a woman who not only possesses such a seal, but dares to use it as her mark. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. Then, she stole the crown not for herself, but for her family. Holmes nodded. The monarchy's ghosts have never truly faded from France, Watson. There have always been those who dream of restoring it. Some wish to wield the past as a weapon. He turned his gaze to Isabella, and others, it seems, wish to preserve it. Isabella smiled faintly. I am impressed, Monsieur Holmes. Holmes inclined his head. I should hope so. I do so enjoy a worthy opponent. Devereux, still pale, sank back into his chair. Then, what happens now? Holmes turned to Isabella, his gaze unreadable. That, I imagine, is up to her. She held his gaze, neither victorious nor humbled. Then, ever so carefully, she closed the case containing the crown. Some relics, she murmured, are better left in the past. Holmes studied her for a long moment before nodding. Quite so. The case remained between them, unclaimed, untouched, and the game at last was over. For the first time since the case had begun, I found myself at a complete loss for words. I had expected a grand revelation of theft and deception, an intricate web of crime unravelled by Holmes's keen intellect. Instead, the truth stood before me in the form of a woman who was not a thief, but something far more dangerous, a royal ghost walking among the living. I turned to Holmes, seeking some form of explanation, but he merely observed Isabella with his usual detached amusement, as if he had anticipated this outcome from the very start. This was never about the crown itself, I murmured. Holmes exhaled softly. No, Watson, it was about what the crown represents. I shook my head. But surely if this were true, the implications would be enormous. The entire foundation of France's current state would remain unchanged, Holmes interrupted. History is not a fragile vase, Watson, that shatters at the first sign of a crack. It is a river, constantly reshaped by the stones that fall into it, a lost heir, a hidden lineage. These things do not revive monarchies, but they do threaten those who seek to control them. Devereux, who had been silent, let out a breath of disbelief. Then all this time, we were chasing a phantom of the past. Isabella gave a wry smile. Not a phantom, Count, a reminder. Holmes turned to her with something akin to admiration, though fleeting. And yet, mademoiselle, even reminders can be dangerous in the wrong hands. She held his gaze, unflinching. Which is why, Monsieur Holmes, I have done everything necessary to ensure it remains where it belongs. I exhaled, feeling as though the ground beneath me had shifted. A case of theft indeed, I muttered. Only it was never about taking something. It was about keeping it out of reach. Holmes smiled. Exactly, Watson. And therein lies the true brilliance of the crime. Isabella studied Holmes with careful precision, as if attempting to discern his next move. The crown remained on the table, its gleaming surface reflecting the candlelight, a silent testament to everything it stood for. You have uncovered my secret, she said at last. Now I must ask, what will you do with it? Holmes leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. Mademoiselle, there are many things I might do. I could deliver you into the hands of those who would see your lineage erased. I could expose your name, let history decide whether to embrace or destroy you. Her expression did not waver, but I saw the faintest flicker of something in her eyes. Doubt or perhaps something close to fear. But, Holmes continued, that is not my profession. He tilted his head slightly. A detective, mademoiselle, solves crimes. A historian, however, writes legends. Isabella exhaled softly. And which am I to be? Holmes smiled. That, he said, is entirely up to you. Devereux, still visibly reeling from the night's revelations, looked between them. Then you will let her go? Holmes regarded him with a faint air of amusement. Tell me, Count, would you have the stomach to do otherwise? Devereux faltered, glancing at Isabella. There was no malice in his gaze now, only the weight of history pressing down upon him. He hesitated. No. Holmes nodded. Then the matter is settled. He turned to Isabella once more. Your secret remains yours, mademoiselle. See that it does not become a burden heavier than it is worth. A flicker of relief crossed her face, but she merely inclined her head. You are a curious man, Monsieur Holmes? Holmes chuckled. So I have been told. And with that, the decision was made. The next morning, the crown of St. Louis was returned without explanation, without ceremony, and without a single name attached to its mysterious reappearance. The newspapers speculated wildly. A daring rescue by the authorities, a change of heart from the thieves, or even a miracle. But nowhere was Isabella Lenoir's name mentioned. Nowhere did the truth seep through the cracks of rumour and intrigue. And just as Holmes had predicted, the world moved on. As our train departed from Paris, I could not help but glance at Holmes, who sat across from me, his gaze fixed upon the rolling countryside beyond the window. I still do not fully understand, I admitted. Holmes did not turn his head. What troubles you, Watson? I hesitated. Why did you let her go? Holmes exhaled, reaching for his pipe. Because, my dear Watson, justice and truth are rarely the same thing. He tapped the pipe against the armrest. Had I handed her over, what would have followed? A scandal, an inquiry, a political game played by men in gilded offices. He shook his head. No, Watson. The past is not ours to correct, only to understand. I let his words settle, watching the smoke curl from his pipe. And yet, I murmured, something tells me we have not seen the last of Isabella Lenoir. Holmes smiled faintly. Perhaps not. He leaned back. But if we do, Watson, I suspect it will not be as a thief. The train rumbled forward, carrying us back to Baker Street, leaving behind a secret that would never be spoken of again. And so, the case of the stolen crown closed in silence. We arrived at Baker Street on a grey and mist-laden morning, the familiar sight of London's streets offering a welcome contrast to the intrigue of Paris. I exhaled as I stepped inside, shaking off the chill, while Holmes, as ever, showed no sign of fatigue. Mrs. Hudson, accustomed to our abrupt departures and even more abrupt returns, merely sighed, setting down a fresh pot of tea. "I suppose you'll not be giving me the details then, Mr. Holmes?" Holmes removed his coat with his usual indifference. "An astute observation, Mrs. Hudson," she huffed. "I'd wager the newspapers will tell me soon enough." Holmes smirked. "I rather doubt that." I took my chair by the fire, stretching my legs. The case, in its grand deception and unforeseen resolution, had left me with much to ponder. And yet, for Holmes, it seemed no more than a brief interlude in the endless theatre of mystery. He settled into his usual spot, reaching for his pipe. It is always a pleasure to return to a place where the only puzzles are self-imposed. I chuckled. "I rather think you enjoy the chase more than the conclusion, Holmes." He smiled faintly. "Perhaps." For a long moment, there was silence. The case was behind us, but its questions remained, and I could not let them rest. I turned to him at last. "Holmes, there is something I must ask you." He exhaled a thin stream of smoke. "Only one thing. I must say, Watson, that is quite restrained of you." I ignored his amusement. "You let Isabella Lenoir go, knowing what she was?" Holmes nodded. "Indeed." I hesitated. "Why?" Holmes studied me for a moment before speaking. "Tell me, Watson, would justice have been served had I exposed her?" "She stole a priceless crown, which was returned." "But the truth," Holmes gave a small shake of his head. "Truth is a peculiar thing, Watson. It is neither an absolute nor an obligation. Sometimes the quietest resolutions are the most effective." I frowned. "But does it not trouble you, letting such a secret slip through your fingers?" Holmes's gaze flickered toward the fire. "A secret is only dangerous when it is known, and Isabella Lenoir is far too clever to let her surface again." I leaned back, unconvinced, yet unable to argue. Holmes, as always, had seen further than I. Holmes reached for his tea, his movements unhurried. "The truth is rarely pure and never simple, Watson," he murmured. "Paris has always been a city of ghosts. Let it keep this one." I exhaled, watching as he stirred his tea exactly 3 times, as was his habit. "I only hope," I said at last, "that we do not come to regret it." Holmes chuckled softly. "Regret is an indulgence for those who fail to anticipate consequences, my dear Watson." He took a sip, closing the matter in his usual infuriating manner. And yet, I could not shake the feeling that this was not truly the end. Before I could press him further, Mrs. Hudson entered, a telegram in hand. Holmes took it with mild interest, unfolding it as he leaned back. His eyes flicked over the contents, and then, ever so slightly, he smirked. "Well," he murmured, tossing it toward me, "it seems the world has no shortage of riddles." I caught the telegram, scanning its contents. "Holmes, this is from—" He stood abruptly, reaching for his coat. "Pack your bags, Watson. Another puzzle awaits." And just like that, the chase had begun once more. As the train rumbled steadily towards London, I found myself still pondering the events that had unfolded in Paris. Holmes sat opposite me, his gaze fixed upon the passing countryside, his mind, no doubt, already occupied with some new intellectual pursuit. "You know, Holmes," I said at last, "this case was unlike any other. No criminal dragged before the courts, no triumphant conclusion, only silence." Holmes exhaled softly, tapping his fingers against the armrest. "And does that trouble you, Watson?" I hesitated. Justice is a curious thing. Did we truly serve it? Holmes gave a rare smile. Justice, my dear Watson, is a construct of men. Truth, however, truth is far more elusive. Some cases are meant to be solved, others. He trailed off, gazing out at the dim horizon. Others must simply fade into history. I sighed. And yet I cannot help but wonder, was there another way? Holmes turned his sharp gaze upon me, amusement flickering in his eyes. There is always another way, Watson. The question is, which path leaves the fewest footprints? Holmes's words left me thoughtful, and so I turn the question to you, dear reader. Was Holmes right to leave the past undisturbed? Or should the truth have been exposed, no matter the consequences? What would you have done in his place? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd be most curious to hear your deductions. If you enjoyed unraveling this mystery, don't forget to subscribe for more Sherlock Holmes adventures, where deduction meets deception in the finest tradition of detective fiction. And if you believe more should hear this tale of hidden truths and silent justice, share it with fellow mystery lovers. After all, as Holmes himself once said, what one man can invent, another can discover.